He judged him for years without ever knowing the truth. But when a desperate mother's emergency forced her to turn to the man she always looked down on, what he did next left her speechless and changed her life forever. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. The neighborhood lay bathed in the golden glow of a warm summer morning. The air was filled with the soft sounds of families walking their dogs, children's laughter echoing as they played on the sidewalks, and the occasional hum of cars idling on the street. It was a peaceful suburban enclave, where the houses were lined neatly with trimmed hedges and freshly cut lawns. Yet, beneath the calm, there were unspoken tensions, quiet barriers built from judgments and assumptions that lingered among some of the residents. Rachel Whitman stepped onto her porch, her sharp eyes surveying the street. In her early 40s, Rachel was known for her well-kept appearance and brisk demeanor. She prided herself on maintaining the image of a respectable homeowner, but her condescending nature was hard to overlook, particularly when it came to her neighbor, Michael Green. Michael, in his early 30s, lived alone in the house next door. He was a reserved man with an aura of quiet confidence and a disciplined lifestyle. Every morning, dressed neatly in business attire, he left for work at the same time, his movements precise and unassuming. Yet, his presence seemed to irk Rachel. She often made passive-aggressive remarks about his choice of music, his yard, and even the fact that he lived there at all. Subtle, biting comments that carried the weight of her prejudices. Rachel didn't know much about Michael beyond her assumptions. To her, he was an outsider, someone she believed didn't quite belong in the neighborhood. But Michael never rose to her provocations. Calm and measured, he met her remarks with polite nods or brief responses, refusing to let her words disturb him. His composure often left her more irritated than if he had argued back. On this particular morning, Rachel was preoccupied with her mother, Eleanor. At 70, Eleanor was frail, her health deteriorating rapidly due to kidney failure. She required regular dialysis treatments, a routine that Rachel managed with meticulous care. Today was one of those mornings when Eleanor needed to be taken to the hospital urgently. Rachel had already helped her mother into the car and was about to start the engine when it sputtered and fell silent. Her frustration mounted as she tried the ignition again, only to be met with a stubborn clicking sound. Panic set in. Dialysis wasn't something that could be delayed. She stepped out of the car, pulling out her phone to search for solutions. She called a few neighbors, but either no one answered or they had excuses, appointments, work, or simply not being available. The ride-sharing apps showed no cars nearby, and the local taxi services line was busy. Rachel's mother sat in the passenger seat, her breathing labored, her face pale. Rachel could feel time slipping away, the urgency of the situation pressing down on her. She stood in the driveway, scanning the street, her heart pounding. That's when she saw Michael. He was locking his front door, dressed sharply as usual, a leather bag slung over his shoulder. He looked like he was heading to work. Rachel hesitated, her pride warring with her desperation, but as she watched her mother struggle to adjust her oxygen mask, her pride crumbled. "Michael!" she called out, her voice sharp with urgency. Michael paused, turning to see her standing in the driveway, gesturing for him to come over. His expression remained neutral as he walked toward her, his steps measured. Rachel quickly explained the situation, her words tumbling out in a rush. She avoided meeting his eyes as she spoke, the weight of their past interactions making her cheeks burn. She hated that she had to ask him for help, but she had no other choice. Michael listened silently, his calm gaze shifting to the car, then to Eleanor, who gave him a weak, pleading look. There was a pause, a moment where Rachel feared he might refuse. But then he nodded. He looked up at the sign that read, "Maintain a passenger standing." "I'll help," he said simply. Relief washed over Rachel, though it was tinged with discomfort. Michael didn't ask questions or bring up the way she had treated him in the past. He simply opened his car and helped Eleanor into the back seat with careful precision. Rachel climbed into the passenger seat, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with the seatbelt. As Michael started the car and pulled out of the driveway, Rachel stole a glance at him. His face was composed, his focus on the road. She could feel the unspoken tension between them, but for now, all that mattered was getting her mother to the hospital. Rachel stood by the driveway, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as the dial tone echoed in her ear. One by one, her neighbors either didn't answer or gave polite but firm excuses. Too busy, already late for work, unavailable to help. The urgency of the situation weighed on her as she glanced back at her mother. Eleanor sat slumped in the passenger seat of the broken-down car, her frail frame trembling slightly as she struggled to adjust her oxygen mask. Rachel's frustration grew into desperation. Her voice grew louder as she called out to passing neighbors who hurriedly avoided her gaze or waved apologetically before continuing their way. She felt a pang of resentment. How could no one step up when her mother's life depended on it? She glanced down the street again, frantically scanning for any sign of help. That's when she spotted Michael Green. He was stepping out of his house, dressed impeccably as always, his bag slung over his shoulder. His posture, confident yet understated, struck a sharp contrast to her own panicked state. Rachel froze for a moment, her pride wrestling with her growing fear. Michael had been the target of her sharp remarks and subtle digs for years. Asking him for help was the last thing she wanted to do. But as she glanced back at her mother's pale face, all hesitation melted away. "Michael," she called, her voice tinged with urgency and discomfort. "Michael?" Michael turned, his expression neutral as he locked eyes with her. For a moment he didn't move, as if assessing the situation. Then, without a word, he walked toward her. Rachel swallowed hard, the words sticking in her throat as she gestured toward the car. "It's my mother. She needs to get to the hospital for an emergency dialysis session, but my car won't start, and I can't get anyone to help." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, unable to meet his steady gaze. Michael said nothing for a moment, his expression unreadable. Rachel could feel the weight of the years of tension between them, the unspoken reminders of her dismissive remarks, the times she had ignored him or made assumptions about him. She wondered if he would bring it up now, if he would let her desperation hang in the air. Instead, Michael simply nodded. "Let me get my car," he said, his voice calm and steady. Relief washed over Rachel, though it was accompanied by an uncomfortable knot of guilt. She watched as Michael opened the door to his car, quickly moving to assist Eleanor. He helped her out of Rachel's car with careful precision, his hands steady as he guided her into the back seat of his vehicle. Rachel climbed into the passenger seat, her movements awkward and tense. The silence in the car was thick as Michael pulled out of the driveway and onto the main road. Rachel glanced at him nervously, unsure of what to say. She couldn't understand how he could be so composed, so willing to help after the way she had treated him. She felt a twinge of shame as she recalled her biting comments, her dismissive glances, the way she had assumed the worst about him simply because of who he was. Michael broke the silence, his tone gentle as he spoke to Eleanor. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Whitman? Are you comfortable back there?" Eleanor gave a weak nod, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for helping us. I didn't think anyone would." Liam inhaled. "Help." Michael smiled faintly, his eyes focused on the road. "It's no trouble. We'll get you there soon." Rachel listened to the exchange, the knot of guilt in her chest tightening. Michael's calm demeanor, the way he spoke to her mother with such kindness and professionalism, stood in stark contrast to the assumptions she had made about him. As they drove, Michael continued to speak to Eleanor, asking her gentle questions to keep her calm. "How long have you been doing dialysis treatments?" he asked, his tone conversational but caring. "Almost a year now," Eleanor replied weakly, "3 times a week. It's confusing, hard, but I'm managing." "You're strong," Michael said simply, his words carrying an ease that seemed to reassure her. Rachel watched him out of the corner of her eye, feeling a growing sense of gratitude mixed with discomfort. She had spent years seeing him through the lens of her biases, making assumptions about who he was and what he was capable of. And yet, here he was, helping her in her most vulnerable moment without hesitation or resentment. The hospital came into view, and Rachel let out a shaky breath of relief. Michael pulled up to the entrance, parking quickly before stepping out to help Eleanor. He moved with practiced efficiency, supporting Eleanor as he guided her toward the entrance. Rachel followed closely, her heart pounding as the weight of the morning's events pressed down on her. Inside the hospital, Michael's demeanor shifted slightly, his confidence becoming even more pronounced as he spoke to the staff. Rachel noticed the way the nurses greeted him warmly, their expressions respectful as they nodded in acknowledgement. "Dr. Green?" one of them said with a smile. "Good to see you." Rachel froze, her mind struggling to process the words. "Dr. Green?" She looked at Michael, who was busy explaining Eleanor's condition to the staff with calm authority. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and Rachel felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. As the nurses wheeled Eleanor away, Rachel stood silently, her thoughts swirling. Michael had just saved her mother's life, not as a stranger, but as a man whose compassion and professionalism she had overlooked for years. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, and she struggled to find the words to express the mix of gratitude and shame that consumed her. Michael pulled the car to a smooth stop outside Riverwood Medical Center, the sprawling hospital known for being the largest and most advanced in the city. The sun glinted off its tall glass windows as the automatic doors slid open to welcome them. Michael stepped out quickly, moving around the car to help Eleanor. His calm, steady hands guided her from the back seat, his voice gentle as he reassured her. Rachel followed, her nerves frayed from the morning's chaos. She hovered uncertainly, watching Michael as he carried most of the weight of her mother's frail frame, speaking to her softly and encouraging her to take her time. The hospital staff immediately sprang into action as they approached. 2 nurses rushing over with a wheelchair. But it wasn't just the nurses' efficiency that caught Rachel's attention. It was how they greeted Michael. "Dr. Green," one of them said warmly, her face lighting up. "Good morning. Is everything all right?" Rachel froze, her hand halfway to her mother's shoulder. "Dr. Green?" She blinked, her mind racing to catch up. She looked at Michael, who responded with a polite nod and a quiet, "Good morning. We have an urgent dialysis case here. Please take her in right away." The nurses didn't hesitate. They moved Eleanor into the wheelchair with practiced ease and whisked her inside. Michael followed, his demeanor shifting as he stepped into the hospital. There was a natural authority about him now, a confidence that Rachel had never seen before. Rachel trailed behind, her confusion deepening with every step. As they entered the main hallway, more hospital staff greeted Michael with the same respect and warmth. "Dr. Green, good to see you." "Welcome back, Dr. Green." Rachel's chest tightened. She couldn't reconcile the man she had dismissed for years as an insignificant neighbor with the figure now commanding attention and respect from everyone around him. One of the nurses who had helped Eleanor turned to Rachel. "Your mother is in good hands," she said kindly. "Dr. Green is the best nephrologist we have. He runs the entire dialysis program here." Dina Pelham. Rachel's breath hitched. "He runs it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse smiled. "Yes, he's the director of our nephrology department. Patients come from all over the city to see him. He's known not just for his expertise, but for how compassionate he is with every family he helps." Rachel didn't respond. She felt the weight of the words settle on her shoulders, heavy with the realization of how profoundly wrong she had been about Michael. Memories of their past interactions flooded her mind, her dismissive comments, the assumptions she had made, the times she had belittled him without a second thought. Eleanor was wheeled into the dialysis room, and Michael stepped inside briefly to speak with the team. Rachel remained outside, standing near the door, her hands trembling slightly. She peered through the small window, watching as Michael interacted with the staff. His voice was calm and measured, his instructions precise. He moved with an air of quiet authority, completely at ease in an environment where lives depended on his expertise. Rachel's guilt swelled as she watched him. She couldn't fathom how someone she had treated so poorly could turn around and help her without hesitation. He hadn't brought up her past behavior, hadn't reminded her of her unkind words. Instead, he had shown only professionalism and kindness. Michael emerged from the dialysis room a few minutes later, his expression serious but reassuring. "Your mother is stable," he said, his voice steady. "The team is taking care of her, and she'll be monitored closely during the procedure. I'll check in on her personally once it's done." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She simply nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Michael paused, studying her for a moment before continuing. "There's a waiting room down the hall. You can stay there if you'd like, or I can have someone bring you updates here." Until exercise was introduced 3 years ago, she was off exercising. "I'll stay here," Rachel managed to say. Her voice was quiet, almost tentative, as though she were speaking to someone she didn't fully know, which, she realized, was true. Michael nodded and walked away, his pace brisk as he moved toward another part of the hospital. Rachel watched him go, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She had spent years assuming she knew who he was, reducing him to a caricature shaped by her biases. Yet here he was, the head of the city's largest dialysis program, a man respected and admired by everyone around him. Rachel sat down in a nearby chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The guilt was almost overwhelming. She had judged Michael unfairly, dismissing him as someone who didn't belong. Yet, he had shown more kindness and grace in one morning than she had offered him in years. As she waited, she replayed their past interactions in her mind. The times she had ignored him at neighborhood events, the sarcastic remarks she had made about his presence on their street, the way she had written him off without ever trying to understand who he really was. Each memory stung more than the last. As she refilled her glass, Pepper took another sip of wine. The sound of footsteps brought her back to the present. Michael was returning, his face calm as he approached. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "She's doing well," he said. "The procedure is going as expected. You don't need to worry." Rachel looked up at him, her voice trembling as she finally spoke the words she had been holding back. "Thank you," she said. I don't know how to thank you enough. They were so hard to reconcile with the realities of my life. Everything became black and white to me." Michael offered a small smile. "You don't need to," he said simply. "I was just doing what needed to be done." Yep, his words, so genuine and free of resentment, left Rachel speechless. She watched as he turned and walked back toward the dialysis room, his presence steady and unshaken. In that moment, she realized that Michael wasn't just a neighbor she had misjudged. He was a man of integrity, someone who had chosen kindness over bitterness, even when he had every reason to turn away. A silent thanks had been heard in the background. Rachel sat in the hospital lounge, the weight of the morning pressing heavily on her. The room was quiet except for the faint murmur of voices and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and she stared blankly at the tiled floor, her thoughts racing. Eleanor was stabilized and resting after her dialysis session, but the relief Rachel felt was overshadowed by an ache in her chest, a deep sense of guilt and shame that she couldn't shake. Michael entered the lounge, his presence calm and composed as always. He had changed out of his lab coat and carried a small notebook in his hand. Rachel looked up at him, her throat tightening. For a moment she didn't know what to say. She had rehearsed her words in her head, but now, face to face with him, everything felt inadequate. "Michael," she began, her voice trembling, Can I talk to you for a moment?" He nodded and sat down across from her, his expression attentive but unreadable. Rachel took a deep breath, her hands gripping each other so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice cracking, "for everything you did today. For helping my mother when no one else would. You didn't have to, especially after the way I've treated you." Michael didn't interrupt, letting her continue. Rachel's eyes welled up with tears as the words she had kept buried for years began to spill out. "I've been so unfair to you," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I've said things. I've made assumptions about you that I had no right to make. I thought I knew who you were, but I didn't. I was wrong, and I'm so sorry." And the tears came freely now, streaming down her face as she spoke. "You didn't deserve any of it, and yet, when I needed help, you didn't hesitate. You showed me more kindness today than I've ever shown you, and I don't know how to repay that." Michael listened quietly, his gaze steady. When Rachel finally stopped, her shoulders trembling with the effort of holding back sobs, he leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and gentle. "Rachel," he said, "we all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them. I never held your words against you. because I believe kindness always outweighs anger." His words hit her like a wave, their sincerity cutting through the guilt that had been weighing her down. Rachel looked at him, her vision blurred with tears, and saw no resentment in his expression, only understanding and grace. Michael smiled softly, the warmth in his eyes easing some of her anguish. "Helping your mother was the right thing to do," he said. "That's all the thanks I need." People were gathering. Rachel shook her head, overwhelmed. "There has to be something I can do. Please let me repay you in some way." Michael chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "You don't owe me anything, Rachel. We're all human. It's never too late to change." He leaned forward and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "What matters now is what you choose to do moving forward. That's how we make things right, with our actions, not just our words." "Yes, Director, I will do everything I can." Rachel nodded, her tears beginning to subside. She felt a weight lift, replaced by a newfound determination to be better. Not just to Michael, but to everyone she had judged unfairly. She wiped her eyes and managed a small, grateful smile. Michael stood, offering her a hand. Rachel hesitated for a moment before taking it, rising to her feet. To her surprise, he pulled her into a friendly hug, his gesture so genuine that it brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt truly forgiven, not just by him, but perhaps by herself as well. As they parted, Michael's words echoed in her mind. "We're all human. It's never too late to change." She knew those words would stay with her for a long time. The days following that pivotal morning marked a profound shift in Rachel's life. The memory of Michael's calm demeanor and unhesitating kindness lingered in her mind, reshaping her perception of not just him, but herself as well. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to reflect honestly on her attitudes and behavior, not just toward Michael, but toward her community as a whole. The walls of judgment and prejudice that she had quietly built over time now felt suffocating, and she resolved to break them down. And there was only one person who she felt capable of helping her do this, and that was Ezekiel, for whom she had kept her promise. Rachel began to take small but meaningful steps toward change. She made an effort to greet her neighbors with genuine warmth, engaging in conversations she had once avoided. When she saw children playing in the street, she didn't just watch from a distance. She stopped to chat with their parents, even offering to organize a neighborhood event. She surprised herself with how fulfilling it felt to connect with people, to see them not through the lens of preconceived notions, but as individuals with their own unique stories. Her interactions with Michael also transformed. One morning, she spotted him leaving for work and hesitated for a moment before raising her hand in a tentative wave. Michael paused, then smiled and waved back, the gesture simple yet profound. Over time, their exchanges grew warmer. Rachel would occasionally stop by his house with baked goods or a cup of coffee, always greeted by his quiet gratitude. Their conversations, once marked by her guarded remarks and his polite detachment, became genuine and easy. What had once been a strained coexistence blossomed into a friendship rooted in mutual respect. Eleanor, too, noticed the change in her daughter. She often remarked on how much calmer and more open Rachel seemed, how she no longer approached the world with the same sharpness that had once defined her. Eleanor, who had always been more open-minded, encouraged Rachel's growth and joined her in fostering a more inclusive spirit within their neighborhood. The ultimate moment of transformation came when Rachel received an invitation to a community health awareness event hosted by Michael and his team at the hospital. The invitation included a personal note from Michael, thanking Rachel for her growing support and encouraging her to attend with Eleanor. The gesture moved her deeply, and she immediately RSVP'd with a promise to help in any way she could. The day of the event was sunny and bright, the hospital's grounds buzzing with activity. Booths lined the pathways, offering information on health services, wellness programs, and community initiatives. Rachel and Eleanor arrived early, Rachel carrying a tray of homemade cookies she had volunteered to bring for the event. Michael greeted them warmly, his usual composure now accompanied by a visible sense of pride in the work his team was doing. Throughout the day, Rachel threw herself into volunteering. She handed out flyers, spoke to attendees about the importance of health checkups, and even assisted at the refreshments table. Every so often she would glance at Michael, watching as he moved through the crowd with his characteristic calm and confidence. He spoke to everyone with genuine interest, his ability to connect with people evident in the way they responded to him. Toward the end of the event, Michael took the stage to deliver a speech. The crowd fell silent as he spoke, his voice steady and inspiring. He talked about the importance of community, the need to support one another regardless of differences, and the role that kindness and understanding play in creating a better world. Rachel listened intently, her heart swelling with both admiration and gratitude. As Michael concluded his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. Rachel found herself clapping harder than anyone, her smile wide and genuine. For the first time, she felt like she truly understood the depth of his words. They weren't just about health or community. They were about breaking barriers, about seeing people for who they were rather than what they appeared to be. As the crowd began to disperse, Rachel and Eleanor walked over to Michael. She extended her hand, but Michael, ever gracious, pulled her into a brief but heartfelt hug instead. "Thank you for being here," he said simply. Rachel looked at him, her eyes filled with sincerity. "No," she said softly. "Thank you for everything." As she and Eleanor made their way back to their car, Rachel glanced back at Michael, who was speaking to another attendee. She thought about how much her perspective had changed, how this one man's quiet strength and unwavering kindness had dismantled years of prejudice and taught her the value of humility and connection. Sometimes, she thought to herself, smiling warmly, the people we least expect teach us the greatest lessons. The story explores the stark contrast between judgment and reality, showing how assumptions based on race or background can distort perceptions and lead to misunderstandings. Rachel's initial biases against Michael stemmed from unfounded judgments, rooted in her unwillingness to look beyond appearances. However, as events unfolded, those assumptions were dismantled through Michael's quiet strength and genuine human connection. His willingness to help Rachel in her moment of desperation, despite years of dismissive behavior, highlights the profound impact of kindness and forgiveness. Michael's compassion becomes a powerful reminder that empathy transcends personal grievances, offering a pathway to healing and mutual understanding. Stella Tinsol. Rachel's journey is one of transformation and redemption. The experience forces her to confront her prejudices, leading to a deep sense of guilt and the realization of how wrong she had been. Through self-reflection and Michael's unwavering grace, she begins to grow, shedding her old biases and embracing a more open and compassionate outlook. Her evolution from a judgmental neighbor to a grateful and supportive friend underscores the profound power of humility and the human capacity for change. The story serves as a poignant reminder that growth often begins with recognizing our mistakes and choosing to do better. What do you think about this powerful story of kindness and redemption? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where someone's unexpected actions changed your perspective? We'd love to hear your real-life stories of forgiveness and transformation. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content.